Hello CS112, today I'll be going over Lab 13, which is class point. It has to do with object-oriented programming, which if you guys are taking CS211, that's what your next CS class will be all about. So they gave you these two definitions in your class points, and then they gave you a bunch of pretty simple, if I say so myself, definitions that you had to implement in class point. So obviously the first one they gave was simply your constructor. It will initialize a point with an x and a y value. By simply writing x equals 0 and y equals 0 here, that means you can create a point with no arguments because it has default arguments. But what I mean by that is you could also call a points with 0 arguments. This will initialize a point to 0, 0 because it has default arguments. But you could also initialize a point like I did here with 4 and 7. What this str method does that they gave you is it returns a string representation of the object. So every time you return something down here in your code, the computer will look for this str definition and it will format it for you. And I want to show you what that means real quick because I had a lot of questions about this yesterday during the lab. So let's first print it with this str method. So I'm going to print a point 47 that I initialized. And yes, it printed at 47. Now let's get rid of this method completely. Let's get rid of the str method. It gives this stuff that makes no sense. It will print the object itself. It prints an object of type points, which is not really, it's like a custom object in Python. So it will just print out like a point object at a memory location, which makes no sense to us. So that is why every time you return something in your code, it will look for this str function. This is like a reserved word right here in function that you should use for this. And it will format it your object however you want it to be formatted. You could do whatever you want with it, but we wanted it to look like this, so it would make sense because it is a point. All right, so let's dive into what we are really going to be doing for today, and I'm just going to uncomment these. I've already sort of types down the 4 definitions they wanted you to do, along with comments to explain what's going on here. And the very first thing you have to do is move to, which moves a point to given x and y coordinates. Now, this was pretty easy for a lot of you guys, but I'm just going to point out it is the exact same thing as your initializer, or at least it should have been. So all you got to do is self.x equals x and self.y equals y. And for those of you who doesn't know what self means, that's simply saying like this x right here is going to equal the x passed up in your parameter. And this x right here is going to equal the x passed up in your parameter. It's just, there's a similar keyword in Java that you'll learn about in 2.11 that it's actually called this. I don't know why I was saying this there, but it's this keyword. So instead of saying self.x, you would say this.x equals that.x, but it's the same thing. It's just to help not confuse your computer by having everything named x. So now that we've gotten our first one, all this is just setting a point to the different x and y coordinates. Now that we're done with this, we'll move on to the next one, which is moves a point by a given value. So it's very similar to this, but instead, let's say you have a point 4, 7, and you're passed through here. You're passed through a point which is self, and you're given 2 different values, an x and a y value. Let's say you're given 1 and 2. All you do is return 5 and 9 because 4 plus 1 is 5 and 7 plus 2 is 9. So you just need to really just add these. So you'd do another self.x plus equals x and self.y plus equals y. So again, 2 very similar, simple methods up here that should really have caused no harm to you guys, especially if you guys have worked on this week's programming assignment. All right, so now things might get a little complex with this whole square root function, but again, this was a pretty straightforward programming assignment. So obviously this is not the correct syntax because you have the upper carets and you're not allowed to import math. So obviously the same thing, it was to raise a equation to the 1/2. So I'm simply just going to return, let's have self.x minus other.x, and let's square that. And we are going to add it to self.y plus or minus, oopsies, other.y. And again, that's literally just doing exactly what is the given distance formula right here. And of course, last but not least, we are going to raise it to the 0.5, which does the same thing as finding the square root of it, which you guys should know. And that's really just a straightforward equation again. I think the trickiest part was getting down this self dot and other dot, what those really mean. But the best way you can learn that is just through practice. So here, this is where you could have had a little shortcut and actually called this distance2 function within this closer function in order to make it faster. So that's what I'm going to do in my solution. So let's call distance1, I'm not going to use underscore, is equal to self dot distance2 other1. So what I did here, while calling distance2, you can't just call it like you would a regular helper function per se in your programming assignments. You actually have to have something before it. See, if I just simply call distance2 with self as a parameter, and I tried to call this, I'm just going to uncomment these test cases real quick. If I tried calling it, yeah, distance2 is not defined. A lot of you guys are running into this error. And that is because there are two solutions around this. The most popular one was the one I had before, where I just got rid of self here and put it here so I can tell this that, hey, this is at points. This is in the point class. That's where this method resides. Or I could actually just cast it to a point and say point dot. That would do the same thing. But like I said, the most popular type was just simply saying self dot and then getting rid of the self in here. But let's say I kept this self in here. So you can see it takes 2 arguments, but 3 were given, but only 2 were in here. That is because this self dot, because this self is a parameter up here, that is going to count as sort of an implied parameter. So now that we've called it, we can do the same thing with the other. So distance2 equals self dot distance to other 2. And again, I didn't really go over what these two methods did. This is just simply finding the distance from self to other, self being a point and other also being a point. And now you're just trying to find which of other 1 or other 2, which are points, is closest to self, which is also a point. So that's why I'm sort of calling these methods as such. Most of you guys should know that though. Now you want to say if distance1 is greater than distance2, to return, what do you want to return? So distance1 is greater than distance2, which means that distance2 has a smaller distance to self. So you'd want to return distance2, which is the distance from other 2 to self. And you want to return the actual point itself that is closer to self. And else you could return other 1. Now, as you can see up here, let's just go to our last step. We did get the expected output. As you can see, I had the expected output right here, and we got the expected output here. But let's talk about this a little more. Some of you guys asked, hey, what should we do if distance1 is equal to distance2? And because they weren't really specific about that, I really think you could have just returned one of the points, because one of the points would still be considered the closest point to self. It didn't really matter which one. But I also saw some of you guys doing something like this, except, oopsie daisy. Well, something along the lines of if distance1 was less than distance, what's going on? Distance2, you would return other 1, and then finally just say else, and you would say something like return equal. Something like that. I'm sure either of those are fine, especially since they didn't specifically tell you what to do if they are equal. I also really don't think they would test you with equal points, because that sort of defeat the purpose of what you're supposed to do in this thing. But again, I feel like simply returning just one of the points at the ends would be satisfactory to